I'll also give you an example. I'm going to give you the example of what I would do if I was to write this assignment. Now, you don't need to do what I would do, but it's often useful for me to show you what an approach could look like and what steps you would need to follow in your own thinking to produce a paper that meets the requirements. I'm getting some action in the chat. I am recording it. Yes, sorry, Cynthia. It took me a moment to snap to it. Secondarily, we're going to brainstorm. This is a chance for us to step back and think about the topics from the class that interest us. And this is a chance for you, moreover, to think about what you could imagine writing about and saying something more definitive about in a broader discussion. What really motivates you? What really drew you to the class in the first place? It's kind of a technical class, kind of specific. I want to hear from you, and I want you to take some time to think about what questions you would choose, or what question you would choose. Third, if we have time, we may do a small peer review where you talk with some classmates about the approach that you plan to take in the paper and discuss what you would do and maybe share ideas about what you would do. And then finally, I hope to step back and have a class discussion where we can actually address that question: what issues should we be studying in the class? What is incumbent upon us as scholars and as students at a time like this, in a class like this? What should we be doing? And so this is the plan for today. And I intend for this to be a little bit more relaxed. If I can be honest with you, I hope that this can be more interactive and that we can get engagement and that I can provide a platform for you to share your ideas and your interests. Sometimes over the course of the semester, when we have a lot of notes to hit and a lot of content to cover, it can become difficult to sustain that interactive style that I do really appreciate a great deal, but that does often have to come in conflict with other considerations that relate to finishing the units on time and etc. And so this is a chance for us to step back, prepare for the next assignment, think about the issues that you like, think about what interests you and what is inspiring and what motivates you to look into the situation further. And so let's take a look at the short paper assignment. This is the text of the assignment. I also posted it under files on CAT courses. In a paper of 1,000 words, that's about 4 pages double-spaced, you will outline your approach to forming an argument for the term paper. So address the following questions. What question from the list of questions on the syllabus did you choose? What is the core theoretical or methodological debate in the literature? What is the underlying debate, or what is the underlying disagreement that kind of motivates that question? So far, what does the existing literature suggest? And then finally, what argument will you make? And so you will be evaluated based on whether you identify the chosen question, based on whether you identify the debate in the literature that underlies that question, based on whether you discuss the existing evidence, and based on whether you outline an argument. Now, this is due on November 5th. So you've got some time, but the reason that we're talking about it now is because I intend on this being kind of a semester-long process, in the sense that you're not writing every day or really thinking every day about it, but I want you to begin thinking about that term paper that you're outlining in this short paper now. Think about the question, think about the approach, think about your argument, think about the existing evidence. Now, these are the steps in this process for this paper, but they align with the steps that we outlined when we discussed the scientific method. And the things that you need to do in this paper really dovetail with that scientific method. So first and foremost, identify the question. Now I give you a list of questions on the syllabus. When I say identify the question from the list of questions on the syllabus, I'm referring to that list, those questions that are given with each new unit on the course schedule. Now, if you don't have that syllabus out in front of you right now, please take it out. It's on CAD courses under files, but you should also have a copy of it as well. We do need to refer to that, and you do want to look at those questions as we go forward, because those are the questions that we're pulling these from. Now, once you select the question that speaks to you and that you really like, you need to identify the core debate in the literature that's related to that question. And so all of those questions that I gave you, they are questions because they kind of get at the heart of a key disagreement among scholars in democratization studies. There are debates underlying all of these questions. And there are different positions in these debates. And so where there are different positions and where there are debates, there's evidence and there's a literature with some existing knowledge or some existing conclusions about this topic. Now, with regard to items 2 and 3, you may be asking, how do we know the debates? How do we know the evidence? That's way too high a bar. Well, the way we know is by reading the Norris and the Tyrrell book. The books that I assigned, the required texts that we've been reading weekly, summarize the existing evidence and also summarize the debates. Now, the debates also appear in the lectures as well, although less directly. My point is, this information is available to you. And so don't be deterred by the task of kind of sifting through this information. That evidence is summarized both in tables as well as in the text itself in those chapters. And so it should be relatively accessible to you. And it's reading that you're doing already, and so it shouldn't be something that you haven't already seen, frankly. Of course, if you're choosing a question that comes later on in the course, you'll need and probably want to do the reading for that week as you prepare to write this short paper, and then of course complete the term paper as well. Now, number 4 is where the magic happens. This is where you begin to outline your own argument. Now, after you've identified the question, identified the core debate and the positions in that debate, and summarized that existing evidence, you're in a position to render a judgment of your own. And you can either, of course, take one of those positions, but your question needs to, your argument needs to address the question. And so I'll show you in a minute my example and how I address a question that I chose from that list of questions. But these are the steps that you'll need to follow, and the 4 things that you need to include, the 4 things that your short paper must do. Now, these 4 things also set you up to complete the term paper, because these are the key components of that term paper: question, debate, evidence, argument. I'm going to take a look at the chat because someone said something. John, the questions are, so if you go to the course schedule, which is the last thing on the syllabus, the questions appear at the beginning of each unit. So each unit is numbered and has a name, right? So economic determinants, for example. And each one of those units will have a set of questions that comes underneath the name of the unit before the individual days that we completed readings for and met for that unit. So take a look at those questions. Let me give you an example. The question that I chose comes from week 1. And that question is, how serious is the democratic recession the world has been experiencing in recent years? Discuss and interpret the evidence for understanding global and regional trends over time. Now, why did I choose this question? Well, I chose it because clearly there is a democratic recession. And the evidence for this recession can be assessed in relation to those regional trends. And we can use that assessment to reach some conclusions about what the future may hold and about what kind of moment we're in right now. But I also chose this because that moment we're in right now is a really important moment. This may be what we call a critical juncture in historical institutionalism, which is a theory that's used in comparative politics. This may be a moment where the normal constraints on action are lifted, and there may be a series of political vacuums that have formed in a series of political voids that will be filled. We may be staring into the abyss, the authoritarian abyss, so to speak. And so understanding patterns of authoritarian rule and patterns of transitions to authoritarian rule is vitally important to understanding what the future may hold and what the political and the social and the economic consequences of right now might be. And so it's my personal view that we have a responsibility to analyze and to evaluate this moment in this pattern and compare it to previous patterns and learn as much about it as we possibly can so that we can understand maybe how to bring it to an end if it gets worse and if it continues. And so what is the debate? The debate is really a debate between those who interpret the recession as a third reverse wave of democratization and those who do not. Now, if you recognize this both from the exam as well as from early in the course, there's a reason for that. It's because this is something we've seen. And so this is an example that we can relate to. And I want to show you something that you can look back at that early lecture to see how it unfolds the argument in the kind of story that we made back then. So the evidence suggests that we are not yet in the third reverse wave. So according to Samuel Huntington, a third reverse wave is a cluster of reverse transitions or transitions away from democratic rule. But he always categorized reverse waves as those that included a sizable proportion of all democratic countries failing and turning into authoritarian regimes. The present moment does not seem to resemble that. The proportion of countries that have transitioned to authoritarian rule is relatively small compared to earlier moments. And so the evidence does not suggest that. But here's the point. We don't need to be concerned merely because of the possibility of a third reverse wave and the number or the proportion of transitions to authoritarian rule. We also need to be concerned because of the qualitative changes that have taken place. And this gets to my argument, which is the recession is quite serious because the new nature of democratic failure has actually helped to re-legitimate authoritarian rule. So what do I mean? Well, even though fewer countries and a smaller proportion of democratic countries have failed and turned into authoritarian regimes, those that have done so in a way that provides legal cover. It's been a process of legal deterioration, and this process of de-democratization has took place under a legal facade. And this nature of legal deterioration has meant that authoritarian regimes bear a kind of legitimacy and retain a kind of legitimacy or a kind of pseudo-democratic legitimacy that earlier authoritarian regimes did not. And what that means is that this newfound legitimacy for authoritarian rule could snowball and validate the formation of new authoritarian regimes in other countries, or could discredit democracy. And so the recession is quite serious. It doesn't have to be a third reverse wave for us to be terrified of the possible consequences of this recession. And the reason is because of the qualitative differences, the qualitative change in the nature of democratic failure and what that might portend for the future because of the capacity of these authoritarian regimes to legitimate themselves in ways that they previously could not. And so this brings together all of the components of a short paper. I identify the question, I identify the debate. Now, where did I figure out what the debate was? Well, in the reading. I assigned a piece by Luhrmann and Limburg, and what I've tried to do throughout the course is assign readings that provide you with a discussion and a description of those debates. And so these questions that I give you will link up with those debates that are discussed in the reading and to a lesser extent in the lectures as well. The evidence is also in the reading. The evidence is summarized and described in the reading as well. And in this case, again, it came from Luhrmann and Limburg, but I also consulted other sources too from the Journal of Democracy. But in forming my argument, I thought about other characteristics of democratic failure in the present period, beyond simply the frequency in the proportion of all countries that have failed. I thought about the quality, the nature of the failure, and some of the consequences that might follow from that. And that was where I used my own creative input to reflect on the information and to make a creative or a new argument that contributes to this debate while answering the question. And this is the objective. This is the objective that I have for you. And this is what I want you to engage in on your own. Now, before we continue, just a comment about information and where you'll want to get this evidence that you'll want to consider or use to marshal in support of your argument that you do make. It should come from academic sources primarily. And the advantage of these academic sources like journal articles and books is that they are peer reviewed and the information has already been collected for you, more or less. Much of the work is done for you, more or less. But of course, it's also the case that it can be trusted. Journals, books, academic journals and book publishers, with some exceptions, are normally respectable and reputable. And part of the process of science as a public process, as you know, is the sort of transparent presentation of information and data. And so you can get a lot from these books and journal articles. UC Merced Library has enormous databases for articles and books. And what I recommend you do, if you don't have it already, download the UC Merced VPN. Log into that VPN, go straight to Google Scholar, type in what you need. The reason is because if you log into the VPN, Google Scholar will connect to all the results available through the library. And it will show you your links and your access to all those results so long as you're logged in through the VPN. And so this stuff is available to you. Of course, there could be other places to look too. If you're answering a question that you feel like is not sufficiently covered by the academic literature, newspapers are a good place to look. But don't rely too much on those because, again, I think that a good place to start is those secondary academic sources because the information is usually going to be manicured, so to speak, and kind of presented in a way that requires less work. And what I mean is that you can cite an academic article in an individual piece of evidence or quote the article itself. And that this is often a powerful way to to martial evidence in support of an argument that you want to make. Arturo, is this debate modeled like a dissertation? So no, this is not like a dissertation. These are steps involved in a process that resembles a normal research process that would be undertaken when you do a dissertation, but it's also undertaken when you do a research or a term paper, where you consider existing evidence, form a question, identify the relevant debate, and then make your own argument. So these are skills and steps that will strengthen your critical thinking capacities, but also prepare you to do research, evaluate information, collect information. These are things that are essential to any research process, in this class are especially useful because of how robust the debate is in the field over these issues. And so there's a lot there for us to kind of grab onto. And I want you to insert yourself in the way that I have inserted myself here. Notice that I identify the two sides in the debate. I make an honest assessment of the evidence, but then I make an argument that is my own argument and add something new to the picture, right? The qualitative nature of democratic failure is different. Therefore, the debate needs to be reconsidered in light of the possible consequences of that new nature of failure. That's a creative and new contribution that I want you to make in your own way when you address your question. Yes, John. So this is the key. This short paper is just a snapshot of that term paper. So the question that you choose is going to be the question that you address in longer form on that term paper. And so in some ways, the work that you do will go into that that term paper. It's just that it'll be a longer treatment. You'll need to cite and marshal more evidence, and it'll altogether be a bit different because of the length of the document. Now, it's still only going to be about 3,000 words, which is really only 12 pages. But what I think you'll find is that when you consider the evidence, the debate, the positions, and then make your own argument, there's a lot there. And you'll ultimately be making choices about what not to include and what to include. But yes, the questions are going to be the same for the short paper and the term paper. So this is going to begin the point in the class where we start to step back. And this is the brainstorming part of the class. I want us to kind of pause and give ourselves a chance to think about the questions and the topics that interest us, what we like about the course, what argument we may make going into it based upon our intuition. And I want to take about 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the very most, but probably 10. Think about the following questions. What interests you about the class? What topics have you been drawn to or moved by? What do you feel sufficiently motivated to write about? And then what question on the syllabus best captures that interest? And so begin with your interest and then find a question that corresponds to that and that helps you to capture that interest. What is that question? This question is going to be the burning question that motivates you to make that argument, to assess the evidence. And then thirdly, going into things, what argument do you plan to make? What do you plan to say? What is your intuition, or what hunch do you have about this question? What do you think is the answer to that question? So let's take about 10 minutes, and I want you to use this as a moment to reflect and talk about what you like. Ultimately, in about 10 minutes, And maybe even beginning now, I want you to begin to interact with us. Share your ideas in the chat, talk about what you like, and we'll go from there. Hi, everyone. I've already heard from some of you. I'm going to begin to read some of your responses and engage with you a little bit and think along with you. Ariana says, for me, it was the concept of democracy being dichotomous or continuous in the way both can be explained by using different measures of democracy. I think I would use Mexico as an example, but possibly also the Arab world, Libya, and the way in which transition attempts have failed. Possibly because of nationalism, as I believe nationalism will ultimately outweigh democracy in transition attempts. So, Ariana, you have a lot of really interesting ideas there. I think that we would want to make sure to tie that to the question about whether democracy is dichotomous or continuous. And so, for example, um, do you think that a dichotomous or a continuous measure would tell us more or less about why some of those transitions have failed, and maybe why they have succeeded in some other places? Does how we measure democracy matter? Right. So if it is it dichotomous measure, does that mean that we overlook some of the space in between and some of the sort of shades of democracy? I would want you to think a lot about that question of the type of measure and how you can relate those cases to that question. Giovanni says, what interests me is the international perspective we hold to identify why some countries democratize and others don't, specifically comparing Latin America, Eastern Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa and their relative measures of success. So Giovanni is referring to the question about what have been the most important international drivers of democratization. And this is a key question for the class and a key debate and a key sort of issue in democratization studies, especially since the 1980s. And this question is important both analytically and politically because the rest of the question is, what are the most important implications for the international community? As if to say, what steps could be taken by the international community to bring about democratization in light of this knowledge we have about the most important drivers of democratization, international drivers, that is. In the Giovanni's case, he wants to look at Latin America, Eastern Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. I think it would be neat to have some cases from each region, or even to have evidence from each region, and to be able to say something about how those international drivers can travel, so to speak, and can exert influence in multiple regions. Daisy says, the question on the syllabus that captures my interest is 4A. Is the growth of the middle class, the Lipset thesis, a necessary or sufficient condition for enduring processes of democratization? And 5B, how far is the process of democratization determined by economic development compared with the impact of political institutions and political culture? Yeah, Daisy, so those are really interesting questions. You know, the first question, is the growth of the middle class a necessary or a sufficient condition? That's really interesting because we can think of examples of countries where the middle class has grown, but has not guaranteed democratization. And so in China, for example, the middle class is shown to be not sufficient for democratization because if it was sufficient, it would guarantee a transition to democracy in China. But that middle class has not guaranteed that transition. And so maybe it's a necessary condition in the sense that if a transition occurs, it will have been because of the middle class, but not that the middle class itself guarantees that outcome. Interesting, because you can look at cases, right? And look at different experiences and compare them and figure out, well, did the middle class really produce this outcome in this case versus others? And then, of course, questions about how far the process of democratization is determined by economic development compared with the impact of institutions and culture. Very interesting because we can think of, for example, relatively well-developed societies again, China being an example, but also some in, for example, the Middle East, where democratization has not occurred. And instead, there seems to be authoritarian survival. We might ask ourselves, to what degree do institutions and culture impact those outcomes? We learned, for example, that the evidence seems to suggest that, well, Middle Eastern countries are more likely to be authoritarian and to remain authoritarian. And not only that, but Islamic or Muslim countries, excuse me, Muslim countries. But remember that it's not clear if that's because of the presence of oil or if it's because of something about Islam itself. But my point in highlighting these examples is to show you that we can identify cases that seem to deviate from expectations and help us to see clearly how there can be other stories and other causes, and how some of these theories don't stack up to the evidence when we really evaluate them, and we really test them in difficult circumstances. Ishan says, what interests me is the way that oil ties to the regime type around the world. I think that I would use countries in the Arab world that are and are not endowed with oil in a most similar systems to research design potentially. Yeah, Ishan, and then the question becomes, you know, what do we expect then? Does oil then prevent democratization, or does it sustain authoritarian rule? By providing the state with plenty of money to purchase the loyalty of citizens who might otherwise support democratic alternatives? Are these rentier states that are able to finance their operations with huge rents from foreign investors, and therefore they're able to remain in the good graces of foreign investors, but also, again, siphon that money to those supporters who otherwise might call for a democratic alternative? Is it because the oil wealth lets them finance big militaries? It's hard to say. It might be interesting to find out, for example, if countries that are less endowed with oil in the Middle East are also more democratic. You could look at a number of cases and try to figure that out. Daniela says, I'm personally extremely interested in Latin American democratic systems and how those came to be and the challenges they face. Personally, thinking about my interests, I would choose the question, how do different types of authoritarian regime affect democratization, both in and of themselves and in response to exogenous shocks, such as interstate wars and global economic crises? Considering that this is relevant to the area of study I want to investigate in my research. Yeah, so for example, are military regimes shorter, or do they last not as long as, say, one-party regimes? In Mexico, there was a one-party authoritarian regime in power for almost 80 years. Was that one-party regime able to stay in power because the party was able to contain conflict and share power internally in ways that sustained the regime? Our military is inherently prone to returning to the barracks quickly because they're focused on restoring order, and they're usually temporary for the purposes of installing a new president or maybe rewriting a constitution quickly. These are questions that we'll investigate when we get to some of the institutional differences between different types of authoritarian regimes. In Latin America, we have a lot of variation, and we can see how military regimes traditionally have not lasted as long as other types of regimes. And so there's a lot of interesting variation in Latin America, but elsewhere, where we can see different types of regimes being affected differently, not just by the way the regimes function, but also by interstate war or economic crisis. So, for instance, military regimes have been far less capable of enduring economic crises than, say, one-party regimes or civilian dictatorships. The reason is because the military already has a challenge legitimating itself, and it already has a difficult time demonstrating the capacity to govern. When these complex challenges come about, they tend to discredit the military more substantially than they would a civilian regime, and for reasons that relate to the professionalism of the military too, and the functions of the military in the state. And so these are things that we'll talk about. We haven't gotten there yet in the course, but we will deal with this. And these contingencies become really interesting because they seem to suggest that some regimes sow the seeds of their own destruction, more or less, and how temporary they can be. Karen says both topics of transitions from democracy and the absence of democracy in the Arab world really interest me. Don't know which to pick. Yeah, it is really interesting. And, again, it like relates to questions about the economic model, natural resources, the size of the militaries in these states, and the ways that the natural resources permit financing the expansion of the military. Transitions from democracy is interesting too, because regime change at all in the Arab world has been rare. There's been a lot of stability. And so multiple kinds of transitions can be observed. And we may want to know just as much about why democracy fails as we want to know about why authoritarianism survives. And so there's a pattern here that I see. A lot of us are interested in the Arab world. And I think that that's really interesting and important because the Arab world, as we've already seen, remains kind of a bastion of authoritarian rule and traditional authoritarian rule and monarchies in a lot of cases, brutal, repressive ones. And so if we can better understand the dynamics of those regimes and why they stay and how democracy comes about in the Middle East when it does, that's a contribution to the literature and to the debate. We want to know the answers to those questions. And so far, we don't really have them. The one region of the world that's probably the least well understood is the Arab world. Africa too, but the Arab world, maybe in particular because of the complexity of those societies. And again, we'll talk about how the institutional foundations of those societies are very complex as well, often because of a role for religion. But there's a lot here, and we'll unpack all of this as we go forward. Yes, Daniela, Latin America has that history of regime switching, and you can find a lot of change over time in individual countries as well as across space. So really useful to study, for example, like Brazil or Ecuador or Peru in the various changes across time in those places. Louise says, I think it's an interesting topic to learn what factors push certain countries to become a democracy and what those factors are. Social, economic, outside influences, whatever it may be. So the range of questions 4 to 5 catches my attention because they talk about drivers that spread or strengthen democratization. Yeah, so these causes of democratization are really the bulk of the debates in the literature, right? Much of what we're talking about relates to competing theories or competing explanations of democratization. Why does it occur? Why does it not? What is the relative role of social versus economic factors versus international factors? These are questions that get us thinking about the role of economics, the role of society and culture, and how politics is affected by those really big areas, right? Democratization is a big process. And so naturally, we look to processes that are equally big in scope and magnitude to try to figure out what brought about democratization. Maria says, I've actually always been interested in government elections and how they conduct them. The question I would choose is, what are the major advantages and disadvantages of different types of electoral systems for voter turnout, gender equality, and party competition? Discuss the evidence with case illustrations from recent elections held under different rules. Yeah. So those are really important questions, Maria, because the quality of democracy in our democratic institutions has a lot to do with representation. And voter turnout and gender equality, gender parity, party competition. These are essential components of representation and the quality of democracy and responsiveness. And the issue of gender in particular is really important because new democracies, enfranchisement comes in many forms. It means extending the right to vote, extending rights of all kinds to all sorts of groups. And so we're talking about everything from women in representation in Congress to reproductive rights and social rights to political rights and the right to vote and issues that relate to equality and gender equality, but more generally to responsiveness and to how well the system functions to represent the whole range of interests and groups and people who live under it. And so you can talk about how different countries have different rules and different electoral systems. And those different rules and those different electoral systems impact gender equality, the representation of minority parties, voter turnout. We'll talk about all of those things later on in the course when we begin to talk about different institutions and how they affect important factors like what you mentioned. And what's neat about that question is you can select those different cases and those different rules. It becomes a nice way of differentiating between, well, those cases that may be better or worse at promoting gender equality and responsiveness and so on. Arturo says, what interests me is how multinational corporations influence the various regimes. We have multinational corporations that have a greater than GDP than many countries. What are policies that have helped them? So Arturo, what I would ask you is, do you see that fitting in with the question about what are the most important international drivers of democratization? Do you see multinational corporations as being a source of pressure for democracy? And can you present multinational corporations as such? And can you provide evidence that fits with an existing debate on those international drivers? I want you to think about how you can fit that question and that interest with the themes from class and the question from class. Yuel says, I have an interest in 4B and 4C, social and domestic drivers of democratization and policy implications for the many stakeholders. Though I lean more towards 4B to tackle factors that strengthen democratic governance. You can't have agency without structure and vice versa. I look forward to building on this. So I must admit, I don't have the syllabus in front of me because I'm looking at the screen that I'm sharing. But I think I'm remembering 4B and 4C is related to those domestic and social drivers, as you mentioned. Yeah, and then there's a question about structure and agency and the relative importance of that in a democratic transition. All interesting questions. Questions that would permit you to address issues that are empirical but also theoretical, and address questions that make us think about the role of human action and choice versus the role of institutions and cultural norms and conventions and the rules of the game. So what interests me about the class is that we focus on reasons that democracies fail. And the reasons that democracies fail are numerous, and we'll talk about those later in the course. But the course makes us think about not just transitions to democracy, but transitions from democracy. And what that means then is acknowledging that democratization is not a linear process. It's filled with fits and half starts. It's filled with pauses, and new democracies in particular are subject to backsliding. And so at a moment like this, it's important for us to assess the situation for what it is, relatively dire. We're staring into the abyss, as we've already established, and understanding the nature of this backsliding and why there's this reversal of democracy is important. But it's also important for us to understand what causes democracy, because if this is what's going to happen, if there's going to be a reversion to authoritarian rule, that means that we'll have to start focusing again on how to bring democracy back and how to bring it about. And so what that means then is that there'll be a renewed role for discussions about the social and the economic and the international drivers of democratization. So remain hopeful and don't become too unoptimistic about the future, even while we acknowledge the seriousness of the situation now. And this is where we start to get into the political implications and the bigger question that surrounds this entire discussion, which is, what are the most important issues in this class? What is this most consequential set of issues of all? What should we be focusing on? What should we be writing about? How should we be spending our time and our energy and our resources? What kinds of questions should we be asking? Do those questions relate to the causes of democratization, to the causes of democratic failure, to the ways of measuring democratization? Do they relate to how we conceptualize democratization? Do they relate to how democratic institutions promote or hinder gender equality? Do they relate to whether democratic institutions are more effective in terms of key aspects of governance like corruption and accountability and responsiveness? What do you think? What are the most important issues in a class like this? So far, what has stuck out to you, and when you look at those questions on the syllabus, what do you think is the most consequential for us living here and now at a time like this? What do you think? What is the most important issue in the class? Does everyone hear that train? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, I don't know. Ishan says the most important issue in the class would be why some regimes democratize and others don't. I think that one of the main reasons for this is the presence of natural resource wealth like oil. Yeah. Yeah, so there's this great article, Ishan, and to others who are interested in this topic, the Middle East and the endurance of authoritarian rule in the Middle East. There's this great article by Ava Bellin called "The Robustness of Authoritarianism in the Middle East." And in that article, Ava Bellin argues that natural resource wealth has been important, But equally important has been enormous investment in the military. And this sort of wholesale transfer to the military and this investment in the creation of a military that is kind of obedient to the authoritarian regime and reliant on that authoritarian regime for that continued economic support. And you'll find that that article is really useful because it highlights the economics of it and talks about the politics of it and gives a really interesting assessment of some of the drivers of authoritarianism in those countries. Ava Bellin. Julissa Renteria says, I want to say determinants of democracy and what determines whether a democracy is strong or weak, or if it will has failed. Yeah, Julissa, so that's a really interesting take because when we talk about the strength of a democracy, obviously a key indicator is, has it failed, right? Have there been recurrent periods of authoritarian rule? Or have there been long periods of uninterrupted democratic progress? That's a historical perspective that focuses on the changes over time. And in Latin America, you'll find a lot of variation. Some countries like Chile and Venezuela have actually had relatively long periods of democratic rule, interrupted by relatively short, relatively isolated periods of authoritarian rule. And so those cases stand in stark contrast to cases like Ecuador or Argentina, where there were almost, there were like 7 or 8 interventions in Argentina just in the course of the 20th century, military interventions in politics. And so very different experiences. And so why some countries experience democratic failure so routinely and others don't is an interesting question. And it goes to a more fundamental question than, say, a short-term cause of democratization. It goes to maybe something that persists over time and that contributes to the weakening of the system. Yes, Ishan, the name is Ava Bellin. Bellin is the last name. The robustness of authoritarianism in the Middle East. Daniela says, the most important issues in class are the ones that influence our lives in real time, mainly the questions of what determines democracy and how to identify the absence or presence of one, also how to maintain and properly sustain one. Yeah, so questions about how are we measuring in evaluating or assessing like the extent or the degree of democracy. And so to Daniela's point, we know that there are serious disagreements about how to measure democracy. Do we use a dichotomous measure like democracy dictatorship that's very procedural and very minimal? Do we use a more substantive measure like Freedom House that focuses on everything from institutions to accountability and responsiveness and corruption? And do these different measures that we may choose then impact our view of democracy and what is democratic and what is not? And then how do we sustain those democracies that we decide are democratic according to the criteria that we use? These are the questions that come up when we talk about measuring democracy. But of course, what brings about democracy, however we measure it, is also equally important. And so there's a lot here. And I like that you're pointing out that how we measure it is a part of the equation because we disagree often on how we do measure it. Gustavo says, for me, the most important issues presented in this class is how countries transition from a democracy to an autocracy and vice versa, and what makes it succeed or fail. Yeah, so we're seeing a pattern here, which is that, democratization, that process of transition, or de-democratization for that matter, are the most important processes because these processes are the ones that bring about the systems under which we live. And those systems are not created equal. The most important differences in regimes are in the types of regime. Democracy also obviously involves elections and accountability where authoritarian regimes do not. And so to the extent that democracy protects rights and liberties, it depends on those elections and that accountability. And that's an important difference from, say, an authoritarian regime where power is concentrated, elections are certain, reversible, and so on. Giovanni says 5B seems to be very important since it talks about to what extent does economic development contribute to democratization compared to political institutions and culture. It seems to have very broad implications to explain what factors encourage the transition to democracy. Yeah, because it suggests, Giovanni, and I think you're highlighting this, that we may be more or less capable of engineering that transition, right? If it's all about economic development, well, then let's pursue a development strategy that permits us to bring about changes in the economy from an agricultural economy to an industrial and service-based economy. If it has to do with institutions, can we change the institutions? But if it has to do with culture, culture is often much stickier, right? Culture often usually extends back to founding moments that usually are associated with colonialism in countries that are former colonies, or independence at the very least. Culture tends to persist, and humans have even been referred to as cultural dopes because of the way that culture can become an influence and a determinant of our behavior. And so this question has really important implications, as Giovanni points out. Is it about development? Is it about institutions? And can we change those things? Is it about culture? Can we change culture, or are we stuck with the culture that we sort of have? And even if we can change culture, does it take so long to change it that we will run the time out on the clock? These are really important issues and really important questions, because when we talk about a democratization process, you've got to understand, and I know that you do, that we're talking about stuff that takes years and years and years. And these processes have to be possible and meaningful within a time frame that is relevant to a politician and to actors who have a stake in politics. This is the dirty secret. As much as we want democracy, we've got to rely on others who have different interests to help us bring it about. And so if this is about culture, it's going to take a long time to change that culture. Maybe we can't rely on a cultural approach. Maybe institutions in development are more important if we believe that those are within reach. But then again, if it turns out that culture is the most important cause, the implication could be, well, it could be one that is not a source of optimism for us, in other words. And so what I want you to know and take away from this is that these questions that we choose are going to be motivated by our ethical and normative considerations. It's also going to be motivated by our political considerations, and that's fine. The questions we choose because they matter to us, because we identify issues affecting real living, breathing people that connect to these topics and connect to these questions. And so I want you to be open to what moves you and what inspires you and what you think is important. And I want you to write about that. And I want you to write about cases in countries that interest you and use evidence that interests you and that is compelling to you to support the argument that you make. But I ultimately want you to learn from this and think about this as an opportunity to engage in a debate. And so we are out of time. Well, technically we have a little bit more time, but I think that we've had a discussion that's been useful. And I think that we took something from this that we'll work with and we'll learn a great deal from. I will stay around for 2 more minutes and take comments or questions, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and you're free to go if you're done.